In today's video, we're going to be talking about, for the very first time, a paper that claims to have investigated shedding of COVID vaccines. And specifically, they didn't prove it directly. Rather, they claimed that the results they observed can only be explained via shedding. So they did very ingenious design, experimental design. My name is Dr. Merogenomics of Merogenomics. Let's get going. And the very first thing that I want to let you know is basically where this paper was published. It was like in a bad boy journal, if you will. It's in a type of journal that seems, from when I've investigated this journal, it seems like basically anti-vaccine journal. When I look at the titles, when the journal was created during the pandemic. It looks to me like that journal was created in a response to the fact that no scientific literature was published at all in any way or format that could discuss any issues with vaccines. So these guys were rebellious who created this journal, and they decided, screw this, we're creating our own journal and we're going to allow publishing everything. And indeed, they seem to be allowed to publish any bad stuff. Now, personally, I think that's great, because we do need greater scientific transparency. You can't just not publish something because it doesn't look good, even if it's not accurate. Most of published information in science is not accurate. A lot of it is theories that then we need to prove or disprove over decades. And so I agree with this, but keep in mind that the journal quality itself might be not of the best kind. That's the unfortunate thing. This is what these authors who did this work have to deal with. Nothing they can do about it. Now, I'll give you an example. I actually did some work out of this journal. So I did recently some videos that landed me in hot water. So I'm not gonna mention any information, which is unfortunate, because I was actually trying to debunk a conspiracy theory. But check out those videos, they are on Patreon. And then they also published a great review, probably the most authoritative review on medical issues associated with COVID-19 vaccines, specifically mRNA vaccines, which was spearheaded by Dr. McCullough, who has been the greatest warrior against mRNA vaccines and been publishing lots of information, especially from the angle of how these products could be creating issues related to heart issues, because he's a renowned cardiologist. Now, this group of authors published that paper already. We did a very extensive video series on that, many hours. That's how big that review was. And then it got retracted. Now this journal, this bad boys journal, landed that article and they republished it. So that just gives you some examples, and there will be other content I will also be making out of that journal, just because they're not afraid to publish anything. All right, so keep that in mind. Now, what did these guys do? What did they do? This is really key. Basically, it's a group of scientists, researchers, experts basically. So it includes research scientists, it includes data analysts, obstetricians, gynecologists, and they created a questionnaire, a very extensive questionnaire for women. And why did they do this? Is because very soon after mass vaccination, it became very apparent that vaccinated women, were starting to observe serious problems with their basically periods, so they start to show menstrual irregularities. And that's actually one of the very first side effects of the vaccines that have been noted. One of the earliest one was also myocarditis, but this one came on the scene maybe even before that. Now, originally that kind of was dismissed, and the reason why is because, yes, there's been rumors of women's periods potentially being affected by vaccines in the past, but the scientific literature has been so sparse on this topic that basically it was treated more like a conspiracy theory. However, once mass vaccination started, so many women got vaccinated in such a short time, all at the same time, that basically became apparent. Now this became so big that many many science papers, at first, like I said, it was dismissed, but then it started to be studied, and many science papers analyzed it, clinical trials were done, and by now this is considered to be true. So that these mRNA vaccines, or basically COVID-19 vaccines, can indeed induce menstruation irregularities in some of the women. All right, so that's now without a doubt, that's undisputed. Now that also included some unvaccinated women, has been studied in this past literature. However, they've never been analyzed for as to why that might be, and or their exposure, and this is what makes this paper a little bit different, okay, and unique. Okay, so basically what did they do? These guys created a questionnaire, 91 questions about basically past history of these women, and they asked almost 6,050 women, 3,400 or about 55% of these women were non-vaccinated. So, and never infected. This is key. They did this questionnaire in 2021, between May till December 2021. So it makes you wonder, how is it likely that you would have uninfected people at the time? At the time in 2021, that's still highly likely. And you know why I say that is because even the clinical trials that brought the vaccines to us it informed us of this. The problem with those trials is that almost nobody got infected in those clinical trials. So you know that famous 95% safe and effective statement? Well, that was based on very, very little number of people, because almost no one got infected. So I see that as totally probable that they could have this many women still uninfected and non-vaccinated. And they compare that with the remainder of women, about 45% of them were women who were either vaccinated or non-vaccinated but did have infection. So that was the comparison group, okay? And about 80% of all these women who responded were white. Over 80% of these women were also from United States. So that's the sample. And they published a paper on this in another obscure journal. So science has been unkind to these authors for trying to investigate these very weird taboo topics. And the paper that they published was on Desidual casts that women were observing. I did a video on that paper as well, so check it out. It's very bizarre side effect. Basically, it's abnormal clots that can be the size of uterus. So this is really, really crazy, and we'll be talking about some of that in this video as well. Okay, so that's basically the background here, and why this was happening, and they wanted to see, look, why were the non-vaccinated women also experiencing this? And they basically claim we're the first people in the world ever to show association between non-vaccinated women and a contact with vaccinated people leading to irregular periods. Okay, so out of the questionnaire, what happened there? They asked these women for 39 unusual period symptoms. And the key question is, which of these 39 unusual symptoms when it comes to your menstruation did you see for the first time in your life? That's the key. Makes it specific, right? And out of those 39, only 7 have been reported, and we're going to talk about that as well. And now we can basically, now that's the background, we can get into the results section. So the very first figure I would show you is basically the figure where they analyzed the proximity to vaccinated or assumed vaccinated people, and they did use the 6 feet rule. And basically they divided the group, these women, out of these 6,000 women, into those who were either exposed to vaccinated individuals within 6 feet, or those who were exposed to vaccinated people, but always more than 6 feet. Now, the vast majority of women were obviously within 6 feet, and that can include a partner who, your sexual partner, or someone you shared your bed with, or someone who was vaccinated in your household. So there's very surprising results here coming up. There's a lot of people have been asking about this. Hey, how is it possible to see shedding from your sexual partner who's vaccinated? Well, this is the first paper I'm aware of that actually even has some sort of a response to that, and it's a total surprise, not even what these authors were expecting. So that's number one. So stay tuned for that. It's coming up right away. And the vast majority of people were within 6 feet. You can see big chunk of these women had a partner or a family member who was vaccinated, those non-vaccinated women, and or vaccinated women. So basically the bulk of people had a contact with someone who was vaccinated within 6 feet, and maybe only about 15% or so, it's just a rough number, were women who were exposed to vaccinated people, but always more than 6 feet. And this is now the comparison group. They will be comparing these two groups later on, okay? Now, out of about all these women, 39% could not recall how soon their menses or periods started to be affected when it came to being in contact with the vaccinated person, but the rest could recall, and they started to divide it into time, and it was either first day, within 3 days, between 3 and 7 days, so within the first week, and then within the second week, and then a lot more than that. And this is what the next graph shows, and this is strictly for the women who were not vaccinated and never infected, so you can see their distribution, how soon their periods were affected when it came to contact with vaccinated individuals. And you can see 72% of them had their periods affected within the first week of contact with vaccinated person, and 50% was either within 3 days or the same day. And while this might sound dramatic, keep in mind that the bulk of women actually had contact with vaccinated people on a daily basis. The bulk of these non-vaccinated women without infection had contact on a daily basis within 6 feet, okay? So it's not a surprise that if they started to see perturbation to their periods, that they most likely were in contact with someone who was vaccinated that very same day. So that one wasn't too dramatic. Now, what's interesting here, though, is that when you look at the other group that included either women who were vaccinated or who were non-vaccinated but were infected by a virus, their statistics were different. They actually had lower numbers than the non-vaccinated women, so and substantially. For example, almost 8% lower. So about 64% of them had their periods affected within the first week, and under 50% within the first 3 days, and approximately 16% of them never had any issue, and that in comparison to only 3% of the non-vaccinated women who've never been infected. So, and the reason why I say this is because this is really interesting. That group of the vaccinated women or women who were non-vaccinated infected, well, only 30% of them were vaccinated in that group. There were 70% of them were the non-vaccinated women who were sick. It's unfortunate that they, in my opinion, and this is the big limitation for me of this paper, that the authors didn't separate these two groups, because this could have potentially have shown a protective effect of COVID-19 infection from having period perturbations. But because they lumped them into one group, we cannot tell this at all. So for me, that's one of the big limitations of this paper. Now, moving forward, that's basically the comparison. Obviously, also younger women were much more likely to come into contact with vaccinated people than older women, and also younger women were much more likely to experience episodes affecting their period than older women, and this was anywhere between 50 to 60% for the younger women versus anywhere to 20 to 30% for both of these statements for the older women. And okay, that makes sense. Now, what are the seven effects that were most often observed? Now, this is now we're talking about anywhere between 20% or higher. The biggest one, around 25% of the time, was the fact that women ended up having heavier periods more than usual. So that was the biggest, most common factor. Around 20% women mentioned that their period came earlier than expected, and we're talking about more than 7 days earlier. Okay, so the huge difference. Now, the next four abnormal observations for the periods are anywhere between 15 to 20% of the women reporting it, and that included duration of the period was extended, and this was again 7 days or more. Another one was serious abdominal pain, like really painful experience. Another one was heavy clotting. So we're talking about clots in a period that were bigger than a American dime, whatever size that is. I I deal with Canadian dimes, not American dimes. So there's so that's the size. And one more was also, I might be missing one, and the one more that I do remember is Desidual cast, which was reported by 5% of women. So 5% of these women claim they saw these Desidual casts. Again, I did a video on that. Very abnormal, very bizarre. Well, I mean, I never knew about it. I'm a man, and it was shocking to learn about it. All right, so there's that. So these were the reported abnormalities. Now, in the rest of the video, we're only going to be now looking at the non-vaccinated women who've never been infected and how they have been affected. Okay, so the first thing, the biggest statistic, and this is really key, they claim that 92% of these women claim that they observed this only after January 2021. Okay, and this is key because remember, vaccination started in the United States December 14 of 2020. So, and it didn't really get going till February 2021. By then, the end of February, 75 million people in the United States were vaccinated already to some degree, and then it continued, really ramped up until it reached its peak. So all these perturbations that these women were seeing at the same time that vaccinations were taking place, and this is key important supporting evidence. And the remaining 8%, the authors claim they also have some sort of explanation for it, because they say, look, they also ask these women what kind of gynecological disorders you might have experienced in the past, and they reported them. Different disorders were reported by these non-vaccinated women who've never been infected, anywhere between 1% to 9%. And this might explain why some of these women did see irregular periods even before the vaccinations, because they actually had other potential reasons or causes behind it. Okay. So that's key evidence number one. And number two, most of these women who started showing these irregularities after mass vaccination started, they had actually normal, typical periods, regular periods prior to that event. So this is, again, remember, this is the abnormalities they're seeing for the first time ever. One more thing that I found very bizarre as well is that there was a question: is how many of these women experience miscarriage? And the only reason why I bring this is that because about 6% of these women claim that they have experienced miscarriage. But the reason why I bring that up is because there's a huge, and this is miscarriage ever in your life, and there is a huge difference between women who were older versus younger women. Younger women were reporting miscarriage. Up to 10% of younger women reported that they experienced miscarriage in their life, and only 1% of women 55 or older reported that they ever experienced miscarriage. So this is something that the authors did not address. My question was, why are younger women 10 times more likely now to report miscarriage than women of the past? I would have liked to know the answer to that question, because, well, it's obviously like a enigma to me. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I thought I mentioned this because it's interesting. Now, what they did next, and we're about to wrap it up, what they did next is they started to compare the likelihood of having these abnormalities in these non-vaccinated women depending on how their exposure to non-vaccinated persons. So they started to compare women who were within 6 feet of vaccinated person versus those women who were always 6 feet away from vaccinated person. Okay, and they started to see, like, were you more likely to start seeing these problems if you were within 6 feet? And here's where the big surprise comes in. Okay, because the first group, the women who were within 6 feet, they divided them into 3 groups. Those who were in contact at home, so either it was your partner, sexual partner, or you slept with the person in bed, or household member. So that was group number one, and we're going to look at that right away. Group number two were women who were every day encountering vaccinated people, and group number three were people who were seldom encountering vaccinated people. And we compared that within 6 feet, and they was always compared with those women, all of the women who were always encountering vaccinated people more than 6 feet away. And here's the big surprise result, because the women who had a partner or household member who was vaccinated, they actually seem to have protective effect for all of these menstrual issues. And one of them was statistically different. So I don't remember which one it was. I think it was for the duration of the period, but this was a big surprise. They actually expected that this would be the most affected group, and it turns out to be that this was the least affected group. And they didn't have an explanation for that, except that they're suggesting that maybe this is not the exposure as much as the quantity of exposure. So they're saying is that maybe it's because women who were exposed more frequently to more vaccinated people, they're more likely to have their periods affected. And there is some merit to this hypothesis of theirs. And the reason why is because it's been known from all these studies that in the past studies on the vaccinated women and their irregular periods, is that those seems to matter. So the more doses a woman took, the more likely she was going to experience these irregularities for their menstruation. Okay, so that's number one. And number two, there has been also some published evidence that would suggest that perhaps some of the information could be transferred that from a vaccinated person to non-vaccinated person. We covered that in the past. These authors claim there might be antibodies, but we really don't know what that would be. And we covered that in a couple of videos. We covered it when it was a preprint, and then it got banned, and then we covered it once it was published, and that video made it through. So there is so maybe there's that, and their own data seems to support this as well, because when they then compared the women who were every day encountering vaccinated person, then you could see their risk of having menstrual irregularities in comparison to women who are always more than 6 feet away. Many of these menstrual problems, those 7 issues, were at higher risk. So here we're talking about relative risk. So what is relative risk? We're talking about relative risk is when you're comparing risk between one group to another. The 95% effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccine, the safe and effective, that was a relative risk that was compared between vaccinated versus non-vaccinated people. If you actually look at the actual absolute risk, so your actual risk, it would have been less than 1% that if you got vaccinated, that this would have been would enhance your protection from severe COVID-19. But clearly that didn't look very good optically. So we always focus on the relative risk, but that's which is the 95% effectiveness, because it sounds much better in terms of persuading people to go vaccinate themselves than absolute risk, which is your total risk, which was less than 1%. And the reason why is because at the time, like I said, no one was big. Very few people were getting infected. That's why your risk of actually, in terms of the improvement of what vaccines, how much they improved your likelihood from experiencing severe COVID-19 was less than 1%, because your likelihood of getting infected was so low anyway, right? But relative risks compares you to another group. That's what we're doing here, okay? And then you can see four of these menstrual irregularities were statistically significant, okay? And so like, for example, heavy menstruation, 1.34 relative risk in comparison between women who were exposed to vaccinated individuals every day versus those who were not exposed to them or more than 6 feet apart. That means 34% more likely to experience these menstrual issues than the other group. That's what it means. And then the group that rarely was exposed within 6 feet to vaccinated people, they had the least, they had fewer likelihood in comparison to the women who were exposed every day. So this exposure, the amount of how many times you might be exposed to a vaccinated person affecting your period, might have some merit. They did one more comparison as well. They compared the women within 3 days versus women who observed their irregular periods more than 3 days ago. And again, there was some statistical difference that the sooner you observed your period being affected, you're more likely were to observe more issues. But one thing that I want to mention here was the fact that it was the fact that Desidual cast was 1.6 relative risk, so 60% more likely that you were observing that Desidual cast within first 3 days of your encounter with vaccinated individual than if it was later. So that was interesting. So basically, to sum it up, they don't have a proof, but they think this is basically shedding of the spike protein. They don't have a proof, but they think it's the spike protein. We did a big series on shedding and the possibility that maybe spike protein could be shed via exosomes, which is tiny fragments of your cell, and that can be released. We know exosomes can be breathed out. We know that vaccinated people can have exosomes floating spike protein in their body, but we've never tested whether they can be breathed out, including spike protein. These authors claim that most likely it is the spike protein, and because of that, they suggested their solution for that. If you're a non-vaccinated woman, you come in contact with a vaccinated person and you start having irregular periods, they suggested spike protein detox. And the reference for that they provided is the video we did before in the past, so check that out. We're going to do a follow-up video to that as well by same author, so stay tuned for this. They also suggested other possibilities. Perhaps it was the actual entire vaccine might have been shed, or just the genetic content or components of it, and maybe any of that could have been responsible for what they were observing. But they're claiming, based on what we're seeing, we don't have any other explanation. All right, I gotta wrap it up here because this is longer than I wanted it to be. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video, and bye for now, everyone. Take care.